by the time the little morning comes, it's like half a day.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, Rabbi Isai, let's continue where we left off yesterday. We were looking at the, yes. Okay, we were looking at the Aruch HaShulchan, and who had told us this quote, cited this halacha from the Shulchan Aruch, that if there's a dispute within the community as to how tzedakah should be distributed, the wealthier people are basically saying, I don't want to have to be assessed based on my income. I'd rather just everyone give to the community chest and let the aniyim go to the community chest. And if there's not enough money in the community chest, let them go door to door. And the middle class people say, no, people should be assessed based on their income. So which one is the correct halacha? The correct halacha goes with the middle class. Now, what the Aruch HaShulchan had taught us yesterday is that this whole the sort of the historical backdrop of this halacha is the fact that in the times of the Rashba, there was starting to become a breakdown economically in Jewish communities because of religious persecution. So in the previous generation, in the times of the Rambam, so the Rashba is really late 13th century, early 14th century. A generation before, in the times of the Rambam just writes, every community has a kupa, has a community chest, and the aniyim go to the community chest, which takes care of the community fund, which takes care of all the needs of the aniyim. That's when you have a society that is running in a financially healthy manner. But already by the time you get to the times of the Rashba, who's in Barcelona, things are not running in a healthy way. There's religious persecution, there's poverty, Jews can't own land, and so many other reasons why there's increased poverty within the Jewish community. And as a result, you have the kupa running out of money. And that's where you got into this dispute. When the kupa runs out of money, what's the next resort? The wealthy people say, let people just go beg door to door. And the middle class people say, no, there should be an assessment of each family based on its income. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that's the latter is the prevailing halacha. You don't just tell the aniyim, just go and do the best they can. You have to, the next logical step is to assess people based on their income. Then the Aruch HaShulchan told us something that's even more sad, which is that when the economic breakdown gets even worse and people have run out of money, then there really is no resort other than the aniyim to go from door to door and do the best they can. Because the halacha will only be able to address economic situations according to the time that the halacha addresses it. When an economic situation is no longer viable to support the poor, guess what happens? The poor starve and they die, unfortunately. And there's no way for the halacha to address saving their lives when there's simply no alternative. And that's just the sad reality that has been the case in certain periods in Jewish history, that there were nebach, there were people dying in the streets of poverty. And there's no way really for the halacha to sort of manage impossible situation. So that was really a very unpleasant reflection from the Aruch HaShulchan, but he wrote it very plainly. That's what we covered yesterday. So it's all in the context of this halacha where a person wants to know, he says, I don't think I can afford to give a full 10% this year. What is my minimal obligation? And so this is what spurred this discussion. What is a person's minimal obligation? It depends what his income is and what community he lives in. Because based on the communal infrastructure, that will determine what his halachic obligation. If you live in a community where there are many aniyim and few balabatim, so then your economic obligation, your tzedakah obligation is going to be higher. If there are fewer aniyim and more wealthy people, so then your tzedakah obligation is going to be lowered. it's all relative to your unique situation. So basically, he cites the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, "Umekoro mitshuvas harashba, hare lahedja shemiikar hadin chiyuv hatzdeka mischalek bein bnei ha'ir lifi mamon shel kol echad ve'echad." It seems quite clear that the tzedakah obligation is placed upon the community members based on personal income. The more money you make, the more obligation, the more you should be giving for tzedakah. So it's not like there is no flat tax when it comes to tzedakah. It's based on what your income is that determines how much you ought to give. And by the way, in the footnote, he also quotes, here, let me just show that to you. In the footnote, he says, "V'chein pasak b'shulchan aruch v'zel shono, u'mi shenosein pachos mima shiroi lo litain." If a person gives less than what he ought to give based on his income, based in kofin oso, based in can coerce him, umakin oso makas mardus, and they can give him lashes in the court, ad sheyitain masha amduhu litain, until he gives what they estimate he's capable of giving. I don't know that we can try this at home, but there was a time when if you lived in a very structured and self-controlled Jewish community, that would be the case. Well, so first of all, we established that giving a tenth of your income is an ideal that is not halachically obligatory. It's not absolutely obligatory. It's what is recommended. It is what is considered to be a virtuous thing to do. The question is, what if a person says, I can't afford a tenth this year? What would be his status? And that's what we're addressing. Obviously, the ideal is to always give 10%. And if the aniyim of your city don't need it, then export it out to the aniyim of another city, right? But so that's really where this whole shaila starts. But then his question is, so when the Rashba says that we impose sort of like an assessment upon an individual about how much he needs to give, does that stop at 10% or 20%? Odilma hashir shalafi hamamon enu tolui b'maiser chomesh. He says, or could you argue that even after the Chachamim said that the ideal is to give 10%, and they also said that even if you're very generous, you should never give more than 20%. Could one possibly argue that if you're dealing with very wealthy members of the community, that there could be an assessment placed upon them that exceeds the 10 or 20% based on the needs of the community and based on their personal income? In other words, let's say everyone else is making a middle income salary in the community, $500,000 or less per year. And then you have very wealthy people who are making in the tens of millions or the hundreds of $1,000,000 in the community. Could we say that their financial obligation can potentially exceed even 10% of their income based upon the needs of the community? What? Oh, as your income increases, the assessment, the percentage of your income goes up. Yeah, it is. That's really what he's asking. And it's an interesting political discussion, right? So he says, Vihine b'me'iri. I mean, look, there's a lot of, what would you say, in Jewish thought, there's personal philosophy and there's social philosophy. In halacha too, there's personal halacha and then there's social halacha. And really, this is where when we get into Hilchos tzedakah, it's both personal and social.
another city. But really, if you're
Well, preferably Eretz Yisrael. Yeah.
So Eretz Yisrael comes after your own city, right?
That's right. Okay. V'hinei b'meiri kasav v'zelushono hatzibor chayofen litein la'ani ad kedei machzara. So the Meiri in his commentary writes that a community is obligated to provide the poor according to his needs. And this is true for an individual if he has the means. He says, and if you see that you cannot provide for a poor person because you simply don't have the sufficient income to take care of his financial needs, you do the best that you can. Ubiaru b'makom acher shahamevazvez al yevazvez yoser mechomesh sheberevach shelo b'shana v'zuhi ayin yafa shebiyafos. He says, and the Meiri continues, and he says, our sages told us that if you're going to spend a lot on tzedakah, you cannot spend more than 20% of your income of any given year. Which is the most generous way that you should give. And the what's considered to be average generosity is 10%. But the bare minimum, even if you can't afford or you don't want to give the 10% that is recommended by Chazal, you cannot give less than a third of a shekel on an annual basis. So that's really the Talmudic criteria. So why is he citing the Meiri here? He says, "Umimasha kasav osa kepikocho ubiaro b'chule mashma sha'achiyuv hulases lefikocho v'sheshiru chachamim dezehu ad meiser o chomesh me'arevach." He says it seems that when the Meiri says you do the best you can when the needs of the poor are great, it means that that the Chachamim say that in general that usually is either 10 or 20%. Ula mimasha kasav lifnei ha imroa ba'atzmo shelo yuchal lasos kenim hakol b'kiyum nechasav hatzlachasam mashma sha'achiv shel osa kefikocho dainu meiser o chomesh hu rak hasher roa shemiten yoser oz yagia nezek l'nechasav. It seems like the language also implies, and I'm not sure if I agree with necessarily his diuk, but he wants to sort of be medayik from the language of the Meiri. I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but he wants to argue that from this language, the implication is that you have to protect your assets. And therefore, it sounds like the reason why the Chachamim recommended giving 10 or max 20% is they felt that if you give more than that, you could potentially jeopardize your income and the financial security of your family, yourself and your family. So the imkain mashma shemi sheyachol latet yoser nishara lavchiv maker hadin latet mikaspo balak lo rak meharevach kol od shelo yifka behatzlachas nechasav. It sounds like, therefore, that if you can provide for the poor sufficiently and amply by giving more than 10 or 20% of your income based on your accumulated wealth, then you'd have an obligation to do so. Because according to the Meiri, the concern that Chazal had and why they cap a person at 20% is because they feel it's not secure. It's not, you're not being responsible with your finances if you give more than 20%. But what if a person is in the mega wealth and giving away, he's a Warren Buffett who could give away 90% of his assets and still his grandchildren or great-grandchildren would never have to worry, okay? So in that kind of situation, maybe if there's a preponderance of poverty, then you would be obligated to give more than 10 or 20%. Even if you've already given 10 or 20%. That's what he's equivocating on this. And he basically says, Lefi zeh, nira lanias daiti, the zohi hakavana shel harash b'shekosav, Shehachiyuv hu lases lefi hamamon. He says, it seems, in my opinion, he says, when the Rashba says every person should give according to his financial ability, and it's based on a person's finances, that's what he meant. Hainu shelagabe ashirim gedolim ubeinonim, achiyav lefi hamamon hu lases afilu yoser michomesh kolod shabar shelo yagia lehem nezek lenichsehem. He says, as long as you know that you are being responsible about the financial security for yourself and your family, then it's not only permitted for you to give more than a fifth, but you're obligated if there's a great need among the poor. And the Avnei Tzedek actually writes this as well. He says, "El mitzvahs meiser l'chud u'mitzvahs tzedakah l'chud. Uv'meiser l'chud einu yotze yedei tzedakah im yadu maseges lases yoser." He says there's two separate mitzvahs. There's the mitzvah of tithing, and there's the mitzvah of supporting the poor, right? So tithing is a virtue even when there's a lower need within the community. So therefore, you should tithe even if the poor in your city don't need it. You should still tithe and export the funds to Eretz Yisrael or other communities. But there's a secondary mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of tzedakah. And sometimes the mitzvah of tzedakah will far outpace, like when there's really serious economic problems in a society. Sometimes the mitzvah of tzedakah will require people to give more than 20% of their income when things are really dire. Okay? So, provided that they're not making themselves poor in the process. So you can't make yourself into an ani. That would be usser. You have to be financially responsible, but you have to look at what the relative needs of your own community are, the poor of your community, in order to determine how much your obligation for tzedakah is. Ve'ilu legabe sha'ar b'nei adam hachiyav lefi hamamon ulases meiser o chomesh dezehu hashir she'amdu chachamim shelo yagia lahem nezek. He says, for the average Joe, giving 10 or 20% of your income is what the Chachamim said that in most situations will suffice to support the poor and to prevent you from incurring financial damage to yourself. Ela sheyesh lihistapek im hashir shenasnu chachamim hu begeder eitza tova shemi sheyaaser mamono karav lios pater gam mechiyav tzedakah. But he says, but what does that really mean? Does that mean that if a person gives 10%, it means he followed the Chachamim's advice that by giving 10%, you will cover your tzedakah obligations? And therefore, since it's only just advice that the Chachamim give, that in most situations 10% will cut it for your obligations based on the needs of the community, right? And therefore, it's possible that if the needs are truly great and your income is enough to help others without threatening your financial security, you would really have to give more. Odilma yesh lomar shekeshachachamim nasnu es ashir shel meiser im kavu shir shel al yado kol echad nechshav nosen lepi kocho umemela mishanasen osu shir yatsi deichova b'chol oifen. Or could we argue that when the Chachamim said it's 10%, they basically said that's all you need to give, and therefore once you give that, you've been Yotze. And he really doesn't leave off with anything definitive. He just says it's sort of one of those gray areas. He just says in his footnote, he says, Uverama hosif al divrei Shulchan Aruch hanal v'kasav zilashon. Now, the Shulchan Aruch had told us, and this is what we saw yesterday, that if there's a dispute among the wealthy and the middle class, you follow the middle class and you assess people according to their financial bracket, and not just tell the poor to go from door to door. Then the Ramah adds to this and he writes as follows: Ki ikar chiyav hatzdaka lefi hamamon. He says, because you base it on each person's ability. V'yesh mekoma shenogan litain lefi hanadava, v'yesh lefi hamas. The hanosin lefir birchaso, roi yoser libracha. Ad kan lashona. So we had seen the Aruch HaShulchan quote this and try to break it down and explain it to us. I don't remember everything that he said, but he says some people base their giving based on a flat tax. Some people, or some places, I should say, it's a flat tax. For some places, it's based on what everyone's economic ability is. But then the Rashba concludes and he says, but whoever gives according to the way Hashem has blessed him will get an increased blessing from Hashem. So he says, Uvizmanenu haminag hu latet lefi hanadava o latet ma'aser. He says, today, the minhag is to give according to either tithe or lases lefi hanadava. And lefi hanadava does not mean according to a person's economic ability, but I think it means the other thing. I mean, we had seen this in the language of the Aruch HaShulchan yesterday. Let me go back and bring it up. Because the Aruch HaShulchan had explained this language for us. Yes, that's a whole separate halacha as far as the hierarchy of giving. What are the priorities? Priority comes to the aniyei ircha, to the poor of your own city first. That we had already covered.
Or spiritually impoverished, in the Kiruv or whatever, would that be on the same level as somebody who's physically impoverished?
I don't think so. I think it's a nice sentiment, but I don't think that halachically it translates that way. Second. He says, "V'yeroili bevir hadvarim, dehinei kfi mashani spor medin haTorah." Okay, all right. So he goes to this whole thing. Okay, the imishum shloyasvi chazra. Who says? Yesh mekama shenasun lefi nidvas liban, v'yesh lefi hamasim. He says, the Rama says that in times of abject poverty, where the kuppah did not suffice to supply everyone's needs, the minhagim changed over the course of time. Yesh mekama shenasun lefi nidvas liban. Some places gave according to where they basically told everyone, give whatever you can, and it's up to you. And v'yesh lefi hamasim. And in some places, they imposed a flat tax. V'hakol mipnei lachatzeno zu hadecha. But the reason why these minhagim started to appear is because the kuppah simply was exhausted and could not supply the needs because of the economic woes of the time. And so that's the way the Aruch HaShulchan had explained it. He says, the imkain mashinagu bizmanenu latet lefi hanadava o latet ma'aser. And therefore, basically, we don't, there is no beis din that goes around to each person and says, show us your tax returns so that we can decide how much you ought to give. We basically leave it up to each individual to give whatever he decides to give, or to give meiser, the lo lefi hamaman, and we don't assess people according to their income. Urak mishum shelo nitan levarer mahu hachiyev shel kol echad ve'echad. It's because today we don't have the ability to verify how much each person makes. Shekedei likboes hashir hameduyak yesh tzorach ladas kama yesh hashir vayir. He says, because listen, the way to such a calculus, first of all, is extremely difficult to make. He says, you need to know how many poor people, how many wealthy people, what is each person's income, and what are the needs of the poor. Barak knows we'd have to go through what is the housing index, we'd have to go what is the food index, we'd have to figure out what is the average minimal need of each and every poor person after they collect welfare, right? It's too difficult of a task for a Jewish community to do in a democratic society and in a metropolitan urban area of our size. It's just not practical. And it's only then would we be able to really know what the appropriate amount to assess each person. We no longer have Batei Din who can make those assessments. But the bottom line is that it's unclear that when I live in a community where the needs of the poor exceed what my normal 10% donation would be, do I have an obligation? That's what's unclear in halacha. So based on that, if a person's asking a question, how much should I give if I don't feel that I can afford the 10% this year because I'm just squeaking by, the answer is it's all relative to where you live. And in a situation where you feel that the poor will be amply provided for, because Baruch Hashem, we live in Canada where there's tremendous wealth, thank God. And there are plenty of wealthy people who make sure that there is not a single poor person in this community that goes hungry. And that's really true. That really, I'm not exaggerating. I don't know of any poor person in Canada that is going hungry, at least not in the Jewish community. There may be people who are indigent because of mental illness, and they're not getting their needs taken care of because they haven't gone to the proper resources. But within the Jewish community, I don't think I've yet, in the 12 years that I'm here, I've yet to hear of a case where a person doesn't have food, right? Yeah. And also, not only doesn't have food, but everyone has a place to live if they want it. There are people who choose homelessness because of either mental illness or stam, because they prefer that lifestyle. Although in Canada, it's harder to do that. I just heard Gila Marto called me this week, telling me that there's a homeless problem in Thornhill now, and that there were a whole group of people that were living in the Promenade construction project, and she got them out. But then when I spoke to Officer Crombie, he basically told me there's a lot of people that are living in the parks now. And basically they're living on federal property. So there's nothing anyone can do to remove them, because it was already ruled that if you're a homeless person living on federal land, you have to before you can ask them to leave, you have to provide them with an alternative place to live, which, the only reason why Toronto has not become like Los Angeles, a tent city, is because of the weather, thank God. Yeah. But it's really becoming nuts. I mean, as far when government doesn't do anything, it's totally out of control. I mean, I saw it firsthand. San Francisco is even worse than LA.
Of course.
Seattle, Portland, any city on the West Coast is because it's temperate climate. So leaving. Yeah. I have 2 kids that just moved out of LA and moved to Florida. Yeah. So it's the quality of life, and my in-laws are making our aliyah now. The quality of life first of all, the weather is unbeatable, right? Unbeatable. I don't care what anyone says about Florida. It's just not comparable. If you think Florida is good weather, you don't know what good weather is. So it's unbeatable as far as the weather. And And it's just the quality of life, though, has so diminished for many people because of the homeless issue, because it's extremely expensive. So if you have multi-generational wealth, it's you're fine. But if you're trying to, or you have some kind of startup where you make a lot of money, you're fine. But if you're just a middle class Joe, a lawyer, a doctor, whatever, CPA, and you just want to be able to get by, it's very difficult to get ahead. Okay. What was, yeah, well, I'm sorry, I'm not woke to that. Yeah.
House. There's.
I-
Homeless.